It wasn't until Yakuza 0 that the franchise became popular outside Japan. The developers decided that if it was going to move forward with an international audience, it would need to be accessible and that the first 2 games in the series did not meet the graphical standard required of modern games.
I am going to finish what I started. No! Stop! Don't do it!
Yakuza Kiwami 1 and 2 are remakes of the original 2 Yakuza games and are sequels to Yakuza 0. 0 immediately became one of my favorite games of all time, so when I finished it, I knew I had to play Kiwami. Before I can talk about my feelings on the games, I think it's important to discuss the expectations I had. I haven't played any of the other games in the franchise, but I did do some surface-level research after playing 0, so I wasn't going in completely blind. I knew the games recycled content and that they didn't significantly change their mechanics, at least before the series reboot Like a Dragon. I expected Kiwami would probably be significantly shorter than 0 and recycle a lot of content from it. I also expected it might feel dated, being a remake of the first Yakuza game released all the way back in 2005, and I suspected it probably wouldn't measure up to 0. But none of that bothered me, as I think 0 is a ridiculously big game, and as long as the quality was there, I'd be satisfied. So with that being said, Yakuza Kiwami was a colossal disappointment. It takes every problem from 0 and either improves nothing or worsens them, as well as amending many new ones. My analysis from 0 holds true here, and I recommend watching that video before continuing this one. I'll recap things when necessary, but I'll be proceeding assuming you're already familiar with it. In order to talk about how Kiwami fails, I need to talk about what 0 did right. Yakuza 0 had a plethora of fun minigames, entertaining side stories, and a great main plot. It wasn't all good, but it mostly was. Kiwami unfortunately fails in every category, especially the one that matters most, an emotionally engaging story. You play in the familiar setting of Kamurocho, though the map has some slight differences. So many problems from 0 have either gone unaddressed or made worse. The bland combat is still bland. The low weapon durability is still too low. The broken healing system is still broken. The bad side activities are still bad. The boring busy work is still boring. And there's still a lack of depth in the mechanics and gameplay systems. I think the developers likely didn't have enough time to experiment, test, and polish Kiwami. Yakuza 0, Kiwami 1 and 2, and Yakuza 6 were all released in a 2-year time span between March 2015 and December 2017. Game development takes a long time, and when you're rushing to meet a release date, things won't be as well tested and polished as they should be. The progression system has been overhauled, with money largely being supplanted by experience points, which often makes money worthless. This also worsens many of the side activities since a lot of them grant money as a reward. Kiwami 1 copies the upgrade wheels from 0, although they now generally correspond to overall abilities rather than being focused on the specific individual combat styles. Kiwami 2 does away with the separate combat styles entirely, has filterable upgrade menus, and divides experience points into 5 different categories. The game still has things like tediously checking off restaurant menus as completionist tasks, but now they award experience points, which means going to them can actually be worthwhile, although the amount you get is low. In general, Kiwami 1 does a poor job with progression. The only things that grant a substantial amount of experience points are continuing the main story, boss encounters, and sub-stories, although most grant little. Kiwami 2 has much better balance and progression systems, with nearly every activity awarding experience points, and it even handles balancing money better. There are now locker keys scattered around the map the same way the telephone cards were in 0, but instead of immediately receiving your reward, this adds a layer of busy work since you now have to return to the lockers to open them first. Maybe this was intended to add anticipation, but it doesn't do that because the rewards you get are usually worthless junk. Kiwami 1 also has a frustratingly long animation tied to picking them up. There are also Mezuking cards to find in Kiwami 1 in addition to the locker keys, meaning you need 2 separate radars equipped to find both. This is my own subjective taste, but the music in 0 is superior to Kiwami's. There are so many tracks that I got from my personal music collection after playing 0, but even the ones I didn't are still good. Kiwami's songs, while not bad, don't measure up to 0's. However, I do think at least 2 of the songs, Vertical Point, the main theme from Kiwami 1, and Outlaw's Lullaby, the combat theme from Kiwami 2, are good. One of the greatest failings of Kiwami 1 is that it borrows so much from 0 and yet it adds so little new content. In fact, if it weren't for the game's length, I think it would feel like a glorified expansion pack rather than an independent game able to stand on its own merits. In contrast, Kiwami 2 feels like much more of a proper sequel. The entire map has been given a graphical overhaul and there are more new additions to it. You're given more freedom of movement and can now transition between exterior and interior locations, usually without loading. There's added verticality in the environments, although now rather than waiting for loading screens, you instead have to run up and down flights of stairs. There are a ton of quality of life improvements, such as the locker key radar not taking up an equipment slot, easier to navigate menus that can be sorted, and fewer invisible walls. The inventory limit has been changed to stacks of 10 for each unique item instead of a hard limit of 20 items total, which, while convenient, makes the healing system even more of a joke since you now effectively have infinite heals. In general, the game has a sense of polish that Kiwami 1 lacks. However, it also feels jankier, which I'll discuss later. Combat is pretty much the same as in Yakuza 0, except the enemies in both games have far too much health, or maybe it's that your damage output is bad. One time I tried upgrading my damage mid-fight and didn't notice a difference. The boss fight against Shimano takes incredibly long. Just look at how little damage I'm dealing here. Here I am well into the game with multiple damage upgrades and it still takes far too long to defeat enemies even on easy mode. There's an added climax heat system where bosses will occasionally stop moving during a fight and heal, which you can prevent by performing a special climax heat action. However, the tutorial that teaches this doesn't explain that you need to purchase these special moves in the upgrade wheel to use them in future fights. Before I realized this, I was confused and frustrated when bosses would start healing while I'd have no counter. Kiwami 2 is even worse. Gone are the multiple combat styles and Kiryu's moveset is the most restrictive it's been yet. In addition to having too much health, enemies frequently block your attacks. The only effective methods for dealing higher damage are heat actions and weapons, but weapons still have limited durability and the amount of normal heat actions is reduced. The game now sports the ability to have more NPCs and enemies on screen at once, but while impressive, this, coupled with the aforementioned issues, makes the fights take longer. Wonky physics have been added to the game for items and enemies, which make combat feel floaty and unrefined. Kiryu and enemies ragdoll when hit and kicks send them flying, meaning you have to chase after them. Movement is jerky and battles often feel like multiple fish out of water flopping at each other. The game feel is just bad. Kiwami 2 can run noticeably poorly depending on your graphics settings. When I originally played it, I had to turn down many of the settings for it to run smoothly, although that wasn't true on my most recent playthrough, and I don't recall whether I made any upgrades to my computer since then, so make of that what you will. Regardless, the game feels poorly optimized. It takes so much processing power that my computer whirs like a vacuum when I run it, which isn't true of Kiwami 1 or 0. Combat was the most lackluster element of 0 and a core gameplay component that needed to be improved, yet it was mostly copy-pasted to Kiwami or made worse. It actually blows my mind that the developers didn't change much of it. In Kiwami 2, you can gain allies from befriending certain bystanders throughout the city, but all it does is add a unique heat action in specific areas. Your fight has to be taking place near an ally, and you have to spend experience points to unlock the moves, points better spent on literally anything else in the upgrade menu. Kiwami 2 has a series of bouncer missions in which you fight a gauntlet of enemies in simple, repetitive scenarios, and both games feature the return of Coliseum battles. Lastly, Kiwami 1 introduces the Majima Everywhere system. Majima returns as a recurring boss fight, and defeating him is the only way to slowly level up the Dragon of Dojima combat style. For me, this meant that it fell way behind the other styles and I almost never used it. It's also ridiculous the amount of times you have to fight him to substantially upgrade it, let alone unlock everything. Majima can appear either as a random encounter in the overworld similar to Mr. Shakedown from 0, or in special, scripted scenarios. Without spoiling anything, where and how Majima appears is fun, creative, and one of the few bright spots in the game. But the system is finicky. Majima can stop showing up entirely until you hit certain trigger points, sometimes from multiple chapters, and it's not clear what they are. After a few initial encounters in my first playthrough, the system glitched out and he stopped appearing completely for the rest of the game, leaving me with an even worse first impression of Kiwami 1. The Yakuza games recycle a lot of content, especially their minigames. Still, Yakuza 0 introduced some new content to the franchise, including 3 distinct combat styles, disco dancing, pocket car racing, 80s arcade games, and more. Many minigames return from Zero but are often noticeably worse. The song selection in karaoke is far worse. Again, this is subjective, but the music is simply okay. Notably, Times 3 Shine, my favorite song from Yakuza 0, is remixed into a worse Europop version. It's also just not as fun to play crammed into a small room alone instead of singing in an open bar with onlookers excitedly clapping along. Like so many things in Kiwami 1, Kiwami 2 improves the experience. Out of curiosity, I also listened to the karaoke songs from the other Yakuza games, and this level of quality appears to hold true for the rest of the franchise, so Yakuza 0 is actually the odd one out. Mezuking, or Battle Bug Beauties, is a reskinned catfight club where the scantily dressed wrestlers are now bugs. Bugs! It was such an obvious change to make, how could I not see it before? I mean, just check it out. Yeah girl, you wiggle that thorax. No, I have no idea why they're bugs now. The game also shows actual bugs as spectators after each match. Out of everything you could have picked, why choose bugs as a motif? You choose different cards for your character and their abilities, which initially makes it seem like there will be actual gameplay this time, but it still boils down to blind rock, paper, scissors guesswork. The fact that you need to find Bug Girl cards spread throughout the world means progressing in this minigame becomes an even greater chore, although it is slightly more involved than Catfight Club, having ongoing sub-stories similar to Pocket Racing. Speaking of Pocket Racing, it returns and is still just as jank. The side stories follow the same structure and even feature the same characters as adults, which makes their involvement in racing toy cars feel dumb and not in a good way. The claw machine returns and now functions much more like a real claw machine, which means there's little skill. Just look at this. The music is now incredibly annoying. Kiwami 2 fixes the audio, but also makes it so sometimes you can't swivel the camera 90 degrees to see what you're doing. In Kiwami 1, there are hostesses you can speak to similar to the Cabaret Club's special training sessions from Yakuza 0. There are only 2 of them, and unlike in 0, they're terrible conversationalists. For example, one of the first things Rina says is that she's only attracted to other women and has no interest in Kiryu. What a charmer. As pandering as it was, the hostesses in Yakuza 0 were fun to talk to and had actual storylines and interesting personalities. They served as wish fulfillment, role-playing as the suave Majima managing a harem of lovely ladies who adore and idolize him. In Kiwami 1, you play the role of the pathetic customer being manipulated into spending money on drinks. The minigame can cost a lot to play, especially if you choose to buy expensive items, although you don't have to. The goal is to raise the hostess's love meter over the course of many visits. There aren't enough conversations to span all of your sessions, so you get repeating dialogue. Fill up the love meter all the way and you're treated to an incredibly pandering live-action softcore video of the hostess, contextualized in the game as them spending the night with Kiryu at a love hotel. This happens even with the gay hostess Rina. There's also a strip club. It only has 1 dancer. Again, no gameplay, just ogling. Finally, there's a photo booth. You take photos. That's it. Why is this even in the game, and who thought it was fun? Kiwami 1 essentially doesn't introduce any new minigames. Mezuking is just Catfight Club, hostesses are the same as Cabaret, and the photo booth and strip club have no gameplay. Kiwami 2 fares far better in terms of new content, but not so much when it comes to quality content. There's a bathroom minigame called Toilets where you compete for high scores by peeing the strongest. No, I'm not making that up. When I follow the instructions, it sometimes just doesn't work. I've read that the game is screwed up on PC due to some kind of frame rate issue and that you need to install a patch to fix it. There are new arcade games, a 2D fighter, and a 3D mech shooter with a horrible camera. They're both awkward to play and I didn't care for either. There's golf. Moving on. Gandara now shows segments from actual movies instead of soft core clips, although shows is perhaps not the right word since you never actually see anything. They're not terribly well written and you can't skip them. Cabaret Club returns and Kiwami makes no attempt to improve or even vary the experience. It's the same minigame again, just with a different storyline and less interesting hostesses to meet. The lack of innovation oozes from it. You can spend money to recruit new hostesses and this appears as a static screen instead of animated introductions like the shrine in Yakuza 0. Recruiting them can also fail, which wastes your money. You still partner with businesses, although now there are indicators for which ones you can buy, so that's one improvement at least. Feels like a minigame that's banking on nostalgia rather than being entertaining in its own right. On a minor note, the Cabaret Club is now named Club 4Shine. I originally had no idea why it was called that, but I believe it's supposed to be a reference to the Japanese word for the number 3, san, so like sunshine, so it's 4Shine? Replacing Gandhara's sexy content is the addition of the Gravure photo shoot. Rather than the 30 JAV models you could see in Zero, the Gravure shoot has only 2 who are shown in successive stages of undress. The videos are quite long, with the models not just looking but speaking directly into the camera, and the game forces your participation by requiring you to snap photos and fill them with your love. It's so uncomfortable, awkward, and unsexy. My statement from Yakuza 0 stands: if I want sexy content, I'll go look for it. When I play a game, I want it to be a game. Finally, there's Majima Construction, the most involved minigame of them all and one that finally has gameplay depth. It's a real-time strategy game where you deploy construction workers to protect equipment from competing goons. Like Real Estate and Cabaret before it, it incorporates NPCs met in the overworld and features a narrative involving competing wealthy industrialists. But unlike Real Estate and Cabaret, Majima Construction has actual depth and nuance in its systems and is actually challenging. It has RPG stats and leveling systems for its units, special activated unit abilities, resource management, real-time positional unit management, team composition, and so on. Unfortunately, it's undermined by the annoying user interface which operates with cumbersome console controls even if you use a mouse and keyboard. It also shares the same problem as many of the activities in Kiwami 2, repetitive, overly long, copy-pasted content that could have been interesting, but which wears out its welcome quickly. Also, while I like the Majima Construction anthem, you can never skip it. Yakuza 0's side stories were one of the most entertaining and endearing parts of it, and although not all of them were good, most of them were. The structure of the stories was an important part of what made them work, and a good contrast as to why the ones in Kiwami don't. For example, in Yakuza 0, there's a side story where Kiryu fills in for an absent TV producer at a commercial shoot. You go through a number of humorous situations before the original producer arrives, irate at being replaced. Then you fight him and he flees. Afterwards, the director has a heart-to-heart with his crew and Kiryu, speaking about the magic of TV and its ability to reach people. Comedy, action, and romanticism. That's how you do it. I've heard some people say that their favorite part of Yakuza games is actually the side stories. In Kiwami, the side stories are so poorly written that you can often hardly call them stories, and that's if they even have any semblance of a threadbare narrative at all. The sub-stories fall into a few different categories that fail for a variety of reasons. First, there are sub-stories that have no business being counted, such as combat training with Kamaki, obtaining allies, or just showing up somewhere. 23 side stories fall under this category. Some are just fetch quests or games of Simon Says with no narrative. Bring a guy booze, bring a guy medicine, bring a guy a briefcase, go to a place and get a thing, go to another place and get another thing. 34 side stories are like this. There are many threadbare narratives where something is allegedly happening, but they're so thin and over so quickly that I don't consider them stories. A lot of them are nothing more than thinly veiled motivators to do minigames like the various Mesa King sub-stories. 16 side stories. There are a ton of side stories that are just excuses to force combat and nothing else. A woman hires Kiryu as a bouncer, he fights some rowdy patrons, and that's it. A group of thugs try to shake down Kiryu not once, not twice, not thrice, but 4 separate times. A guy claims that you stepped on his contact lenses and demands remuneration, but it's a scam. An unknown caller says Kiryu owes him money, but it's a scam. A shady businessman tries to sell a modem, but it's a scam. A scammer tries to scam Kiryu, and it's a scam. These are not scams. These are not stories, these are random encounters in disguise. 47 side stories in the game fall under this category. So many side stories involve pointlessly running from one location to another, backtracking, finding where to buy a specific item, and so on. Their designs kill interest and pacing. There are so many side stories with events that don't connect or relate to each other at all. You stumble across an arguing couple, and then the guy pulls a knife, and then Kiryu fights him, and then another guy comes along, and then a police officer shows up, and then the couple leaves, and then you take the other guy who intervened on a tour of the city, and then you spar with him. Instead of logically connected A happened, therefore B happens, they're how a small child tells stories, and then, and then, and then. I only consider 18 side stories in both games combined to be actual narratives, and even then they're mediocre. For example, one of Club Forshine's hostesses, Koyuki, wants Kiryu to help track down a panty thief. You find him and whoops, turns out he accidentally stole her grandma's panties by mistake. Please call a doctor, the sides of my body have split open and my innards are leaking out. Kiryu is hired to be a voice actor for a story he's unaware is a boy's love narrative. That's the joke. Kiryu stumbles upon a private club where grown men wear diapers and are treated like babies. Get it? It's funny because it's so weird. At least, I hope that's the joke and not let's make fun of people with fetishes. The side stories in Yakuza 0 were fun, lighthearted, and had a sense of optimism. In Kiwami, Kiryu usually acts annoyed with the people he meets. The stories are often mean-spirited and pessimistic, and that's if they're not simply downright bizarre or pointless. For example, one of them involves a pair of opposite-gender siblings who both cross-dress, but there's no social commentary or any meaning to it. They attack Kiryu, he beats them up, they run away. What's the joke? What's the message? Is it really, some people are weird and different, point and laugh at them? The only good side story in either game is In the Name of Art from Kiwami 2, which involves an overenthusiastic photographer who takes sexy calendar photos of Kiryu, who plays along sportingly, and it's actually funny. Between Kiwami 1 and 2, there are 153 side stories, and only one of them was worthwhile. Only one out of 153 in the entirety of both games. That's a success rate of 0.006%. That's a super F. To me, the core of Yakuza 0 was its story. Sure, the minigames and side missions added to the experience, but the main story was its heart and soul. So even with nearly all of Kiwami 1's side content being mediocre, if the main story was good, I could still walk away from the game singing its praises. But the main story is a morose farce. Things start off well enough, but Kiwami is like a tapestry with a few frayed threads, and the more you pull on them, the more everything comes apart. This is your last chance to back out before spoilers. The premise is that Kiryu and Nishiki's childhood friend Yumi, who grew up in the orphanage with them, is forced upon by Patriarch Dojima, but Nishiki intervenes and kills him. Kiryu takes the blame for him out of loyalty and is imprisoned for 10 years. During Kiryu's imprisonment, Nishiki slowly turns evil, his descent into darkness periodically shown in flashbacks throughout the game. Around the time Kiryu is released from prison, a huge sum of 10 billion yen is stolen from the Tojo clan's coffers. That all sounds well and good, but the execution is horrible. It feels like nothing was thought out ahead of time. In Yakuza 0, there's a huge cast of characters, but every one of them has the same goal, to acquire the empty lot. Makoto is its owner, Tachibana is trying to obtain it as well, and even Kiryu being framed for murder is related to it. Everything and everyone has a common through line. In Kiwami 1, there are a ton of characters and storylines, and every one of them is going in different directions. The Tojo clan's money was stolen, but also there's an important child named Haruka who Kiryu stumbles upon by complete accident. Nishiki's become a villain who wants to rise in the ranks of the Yakuza, and his plans also have nothing to do with either the stolen money or Haruka. Haruka herself is a boring, blank slate of a character with no personality. The delivery of her dialogue never changes and is serviceable at best, even though the other voice actors do a good job. Listen to the way she reacts to being in a bar shootout where multiple people were killed, or seeing her mother die in front of her.
何しにここに?
お母さん探して、私いろんなとこで聞いて、お母さん。
Now compare that to Makoto from Yakuza 0.
怖かった。怖かったよ。
This is how you do it. Nishiki is the main antagonist until he isn't anymore because another one is introduced, but then the game can't decide who should fill what role. There's a detective named Date who's pointless to the overall story along with the owners of Club Stardust. Characters take actions that make no sense. Nishiki tries to assassinate Kazama because why? Who knows? What was his plan exactly? Shimano, who spent all of Yakuza 0 plotting and ended that game planning to take over the Tojo clan after more long-term scheming, apparently spent all that time doing nothing because he has no plan in Kiwami. Kazama, the genius tactician who orchestrated the power struggle against Dojima, evidently just let Nishiki turn evil over the last 10 years without intervening. It's a mess. Not a mess around the edges like Yakuza 0, which stumbled on things like quick healing wounds and other flawed action movie logic. No, it's a mess in its core storytelling. Throughout the game's flashbacks, Nishiki is shown to be lacking both physical strength and leadership skills. He's constantly compared unfavorably to Kiryu and is clearly living in his shadow. Rather than feeling grateful for Kiryu's sacrifice, he feels resentment. An important part of Nishiki's corruption is his biological sister who's sick in the hospital and needs money for a heart transplant. A sister who was so important to him that he never mentioned her in the entirety of Yakuza 0. A sister we never actually see on screen even once in Kiwami. It blows my mind that the game fails to show this crucial character. Was it a budget issue? If they couldn't model and animate the character, couldn't they have at least had her speak to Nishiki on the phone or something? And then there's the aspect of the main story that I consider unforgivable. The pacing is awful and the game is overflowing with padding and filler. At least 50% of the story could have been cut with no major change to the plot. For example, as I mentioned earlier, Club Stardust's owners and Date could have been removed from the story without issue. The game constantly stops dead in its tracks to pursue irrelevant digressions or foist busy work on you. For example, Kiryu buys Yumi a ring as a birthday gift. A pickpocket steals it. You track down the pickpocket and oh no, it turns out he already sold it. You go to the pawn shop, but oh no, the owner doesn't believe it's yours and demands you pay for it, but oh no, you don't have enough money. You find your subordinate Shinji and borrow money from him. You return to the pawn shop, but oh no, the owner raised the ring's price while you were gone, so you still don't have enough. You go find Shinji again and borrow more money. You return and the owner now believes your story and gives you the ring without needing to be paid. What a waste of time. This is one of the first things you do in the game, by the way. You find a hungry dog. Go to the store and buy food. Backtrack to the dog. Oh no, the dog's thirsty. Go to the store and buy water. Backtrack to the dog. Oh no, the dog can't drink the water without a container for it. Seriously? Go to the store and buy a paper plate. Backtrack to the dog. Now the dog can drink. What does this have to do with anything? Haruka's been kidnapped. Go track down 3 different gangs one at a time and fight them all and still don't find her. The story is full of this pointless busywork and padding. The story is full of tons of stuff that makes no sense, never gets answered, or otherwise doesn't work. Cutscenes fade to black only to fade in before fading to black again. Characters don't age. They look the same in 2006 as their Yakuza 0 counterparts did 18 years ago in 1988. Majima gets stabbed in the gut. You can immediately find him standing outside West Park completely fine and neither of you mention it. Later he gets shot yet again in the abdomen and falls into the ocean without resurfacing. He shows up in the next scene perfectly fine. At a dice game, Kiryu bets odd or even based on Haruka's guesses. She'll comment in the cutscene about how they're winning because of her intuition even if you lost during gameplay. The gambler is cheating not because the dice are loaded, but because they have tiny pneumatic pins that phase in and out of its surface. Date's police career and family life was derailed because he didn't believe a criminal he never met before when he confessed to killing another criminal, and apparently was so obsessed with the case that he shows up to aid Kiryu when he gets out of prison 10 years later. After Kazama is shot by Nishiki, the Yakuza barge into the room and immediately accuse Kiryu of being an assassin. Neither Kiryu nor Kazama, who is still conscious, attempt to explain what happened, nor did the Yakuza notice that Kiryu doesn't have a gun. Why was Haruka at a bar? How did she get into a bar alone when underage? Who shot up the bar? Why? And why did they leave Haruka behind? Never answered. Why did Terada leave the locket that's a key which opens a vault containing 10 billion yen with Haruka instead of taking it? For that matter, why did Majima's crew kidnap her in the first place? How does anyone other than Yumi even know the pendant is a key? If Yumi needed an alternate identity to hide from Jingu, why would she say that she's her own sister and even go back to work at the bar she used to work at? How did Reina and everyone else she was friends with not recognize her face or voice? Why did she leave her own daughter in an orphanage, lie to her about being her aunt, and leave her with the pendant key which would make her a target? This guy shoots his comrade to prevent him from revealing information instead of shooting Kiryu, who's standing right next to him. Kiryu and friends are on a docked boat when they're surrounded by the Shimano family. Kiryu fights his way off the boat and it's bombed. His allies survive apparently by teleporting since Kiryu was ahead of them and we never see them escape. Yumi steals the 10 billion yen, safeguards it in a vault, but then wants to blow it up with a bomb. Why destroy the money now? If that was her goal all along, why not destroy it in the first place instead of stealing it? How did she even get a bomb? Nishiki, an ambitious man who wants to rise to the top of the Tojo clan, apparently gives up on a whim and decides to commit suicide by shooting and triggering the bomb, possibly killing the woman he loves in the process when he could just shoot Kiryu and take the money. Nishiki suffers from the Kylo Ren villain problem. He's presented over and over as a failure, a loser, and a fuck-up, so much so that by the end of the game, when he should be an intimidating, sinister presence, he's not. He's a weak, pathetic man who can't hold his own as the game's antagonist. But none of that matters because Nishiki gets sidelined in his own story to make way for a second antagonist who doesn't have any connection to him or his goals. Meet Jingu, a psychopath who wants to murder his own daughter because she's inconvenient. He's a comical, Saturday morning cartoon villain who laughs maniacally and would twirl his mustache if he had one. But the mess of a narrative and poor characterization isn't the story's greatest flaw. It took me a while to put my finger on the big problem, but eventually I figured it out. Yakuza Kiwami is the last Jedi of Yakuza games. Although I think it's unintentional, Yakuza Kiwami is obsessed with deconstructing characters and destroying their legacies. Every character either fails, is corrupted, or dies. In fact, let's compare it to Yakuza 0. The game has a lot of characters, and many of them either die or are jailed, presumably for life. Kiwami introduces many new characters and has slightly more in total than 0 does. It also has many characters who die, but less in total than 0. So if 0 has the higher body count, why does Kiwami feel more nihilistic? Like many things, it's in the execution. In Yakuza 0, when Tachibana dies, it's to protect his sister. When Shibusawa gets taken down, it's in a climactic showdown at the end of the game. Most of the deaths occur late in the game at the end of character arcs or in climactic final encounters. The characters have opportunities to perform heroic or remarkable feats, to rescue others, and to demonstrate love and loyalty. Kiwami, on the other hand, is a much shorter game and the character deaths are spread more evenly throughout it. Characters die at the drop of a hat with no rhyme or reason. When Kazama dies, he dies because it's dramatic. When Shinji and Reina die, they die just because, I think for shock value, which doesn't land largely because Shinji has barely been in the game. When Shimano dies, he also dies just because. None of these characters die heroically, protecting someone, or accomplishing anything. It doesn't help that the new characters are bland and boring. It makes the cast feel smaller, and thus every legacy character death is worse. Nishiki constantly fails at everything, and no one is able to save him from his demons. Kiryu fails to save the important people around him, his father, his love, and his brother. Everyone in the game fails, loses, and dies. It's so disheartening and joyless. When I reminisce about Yakuza 0, it conjures feelings of loyalty, perseverance, hope, brotherhood, and love. When I recall Kiwami, I think about nihilism, hopelessness, and despair. It's a bleak, soul-sucking experience. So with all that being said, after Kiwami 1, I was very hesitant going into Kiwami 2. However, Kiwami 1 did end on an intriguing note, with Kiryu now being the sole parent of an adoptive daughter. What an interesting dynamic to explore in the next game. How would Kiryu handle being a dad? How would that be incorporated into gameplay? The answer is, it isn't. Kiwami 2 immediately sidelines Haruka for almost the entire game. In fact, Kiwami 2 builds on almost nothing from the prior games and seems tunnel-visioned on introducing brand new characters and conflicts. What's the point of being a sequel if you take little to nothing from the preceding works? Once again, the story is marred with derivative copying. The Millennium Tower is blown up, again, which doesn't carry the same impact because it's the second time we see this happen. Kiwami 2 fully solidifies itself as an ungrounded James Bond movie. There's a Dark Knight-style surveillance camera hub that monitors every square inch of Kamurocho. There's a secret cabal of Korean agents with a 26-year-long blood oath to destroy Kamurocho. These are concepts not to be taken seriously, better left to goofy side stories, yet they're part of the main plot. Kiwami 1's story, while disappointing, was intriguing enough for me to want to finish it. Every step of Nishiki's journey was one I didn't like, but I was invested in it and I still wanted to see how it would end. Kiwami 2 has a terminal case of squirrel brain. By my count, there are 9 separate factions with barely connected goals, each having only partial familiarity with the others. The plot is criminally unfocused, ping-ponging around and going on random, pointless tangents. Any given scene may have no connection to the one preceding it and may itself be filler. Because the story has no focus, it can't maintain a comprehensible through line and you never know what's going on, what the characters' goals are, or what progress looks like. Characters stand around and talk aimlessly as though they lost the script on the way over and had to improv. Take this scene as an example.
Ohayo, Kiryu-han. 葬儀の日に殴り込むとは。寺田藩には昔お世話になったさかい。あんた何者や。若頭代行の柏木だ。合田会長はどこにいるんだ。空気のええところで。てめえ、喧嘩売りに来たのか。ちゃいますねん、ちゃいますねん。 香典です。お納めください。あんたが会長代行やな。再選だと。せやけど、うちには礼儀知らずのおっさんがおるからの。
The story is incredibly slow. You're always lost, always unsure of what's happening, never know who wants what, why they do the things they do, what anyone's next move is, and you're constantly exposed to filler. As a result, Kiwami 2 is boring. So goddamn boring. The main story is so uninteresting that when I originally played the game a year ago, I quit halfway through. The full story features more inane nonsense, double, triple, quadruple crosses, contradictions, plot holes, and so forth. I could go into detail and analyze everything with a fine-tooth comb, but I think it's not worth discussing. Before replaying the game for this video, I struggled to recall much of what happened. There's also a comparably shorter side story where you play as Majima. It's an uninteresting experience overall, but there's a digression where he reunites with Makoto. It's nice to see her again, but it's an unnecessary continuation of her story and only works due to nostalgia. It's a testament to the strength of Yakuza 0's writing, not Kiwami's. It's a damn shame because these games clearly have a ton of effort put into them and they're not all bad. I can find enjoyment in a game with mediocre gameplay but a great story and vice versa, but not one that fails at both. Yakuza 0 engendered so much goodwill in me that even after being disappointed by Kiwami 1 and 2, I'm still interested in the rest of the franchise. Are Yakuza 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 worth playing? How about spin-offs like Judgment? Let me know in the comments. So this is the part of the video that I'm recording unscripted. I wanted to speak a bit more about my thoughts after I finished playing these games for the review and wanted to talk more off the cuff. This is my first attempt at a negative review, and what I learned from doing that is that I really don't like doing them. I'd much rather be positive. I try to base my content off of people like Bob Ross or Mr. Rogers, people who inspire positivity and have pleasant things to say. That's not to say that you should never criticize or that you should ignore flaws, but I just don't want to be lumped in with the many critics who have that negative niche on YouTube already and be another person dogpiling on stuff. You know, I'm as big a fan as anyone else of people like Red Letter Media, and, you know, it can be fun to analyze and critique stuff in, as they describe it, nitpicky asshole fashion, but I just didn't want to be another person piling in on that sort of thing, and what I learned from making this review is that I just would rather be positive. After I played Yakuza 0 and Kiwami 1 and 2, I never planned on continuing the series. And then Steam had their sale recently where they put all of the remastered games, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 on sale. So I figured I may as well buy them now and see what they're like. I think I'll probably stream those, so look forward to that. Anyway, thanks for watching the video. Subscribe if you'd like to see more.